Welcome, everybody. It's great to see that so many of you were able to attend today, and what I know is going to be a really terrific session. I'm Margot Rogers. I'm a member of the LEAP Ambassadors community, one of the co-sponsors of today's webinar. We have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, when you signed into the session, you were automatically put into webinar mode, which means that your video has been disabled and you're on mute. But if you have questions over the course of our session today, and we certainly hope that you will, you simply type them into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. We'll try to be as responsive as possible throughout our session today to questions as you type them in, but in any event, we've reserved time at the end to answer questions. Secondly, we will be recording this webinar, and at the end of the session, you'll receive a follow-up email which has a link to the recording so that you can share it with colleagues. You'll also receive a follow-up email with links to the various reports and documents that we're talking about today, in addition to some other information. So today we're here to discuss a fresh take on the Funder-Grantee power dynamic. And we'll start by hearing from Phil Buchanan, who's the president of the Center for Effective Philanthropy. Phil's going to talk to us about some research that they've done about the importance of trust in the grantee-funder relationship. Then we will hear from Jennifer Hoos Rothberg, who's the executive director of the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust, about the important work they've been doing to shift the funder-grantee dynamic by focusing largely on organizational performance, on building strong organizations, and of course, all built on a foundation of trust. So the focus of all of our collective work, of course, is to enable grantees to accomplish great things for the beneficiaries and the causes that they serve. And that's the goal of everybody who's attending this webinar. And it's incumbent on all of us as funders, and I put myself in this group as a funder for 8 years, to think about it in ways that not just enable grantees to meet sort of 1 year or 2 year grant cycle metrics as hopefully co-created by funders and by grantees, but to help them build strong organizations over time that have the ability to deliver over a prolonged period of time meaningful, measurable, and financially sustainable results for the people or the causes that they serve. This is what everyone on this webinar wants to accomplish, and it in fact is core to LEAP's mission, which I won't read here, but is very much focused on building great organizations for greater societal impact, and on using high performance as the path to this end. So my closing thoughts as a former funder are, it strikes me, and I think Phil and Jennifer will talk more about this, but that in order to accomplish this, organizations really need to be able to ask for what it is they need from their philanthropic partners. And that they can only do that if they have built trusting relationships with those partners, first and foremost. But if they also believe that it will make a difference if they raise those issues. And so I think Phil and Jen are going to talk to us today about how you build those trusting relationships, and how you communicate and talk about and demonstrate through your actions that in fact those issues that are raised by grantees on the basis of that trust matter to their funders, and that their funders are willing to take action with them, alongside them, to build stronger organizations that will result in meaningful impact over time. So with that, I'm thrilled to pass this along to Phil and to Jennifer to hear from them. Again, if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A box on your Zoom bar. And thanks very much again for being here. I'm excited about the day.
Thanks, Margot. Great to be with everybody today. CEP is an organization some of you may know, some of you may not. We're focused on providing data and creating insight to help funders improve their effectiveness and ultimately their impact. In my experience, not everybody necessarily believes that right off the bat that strong relationships are a necessary component of achieving impact. Funders don't always think that their relationships with their grantees, sometimes they need a little persuasion to recognize that connection. But we at CEP really believe that relationships are crucial, and for the reasons Margot's alluded to already. And it can be tough to even understand as a funder whether you have a strong relationship with your grantees. Funders are, after all, in a sort of bubble of positivity, surrounded by folks who are predisposed to tell them what they think they want to hear. People use a lot of analogies for the funder-grantee relationship. Most of them aren't very apt, really. Probably the one I hear the most is, well, grantees are like our customers, but they're not actually like your customers, because the money is flowing in the opposite direction and the power dynamic is completely different. If I go out to dinner tonight and have a terrible experience, nothing's holding me back from trashing that place to just about anybody will listen and online on any site I can find. If I have a really challenging call with a program officer on whose support CEP depends, I might not take to the internet or the streets to tell everybody what a difficult experience that was. So that's part of the reason that CEP created the Grantee Perception Report 15 years ago, which allows funders to understand how they're doing in their eyes of their grantees on a range of different dimensions, and then puts that data into comparative context. So without comparative context, it's hard to know, is a 5.5 on a 1 to 7 scale on average good on this dimension? Not so good, but the comparative data allows meaning to be made of the perspectives of grantees. And it's given the several hundred funders that have participated in the GPR over the years, the opportunity to figure out how they want to improve, how they want to get better so that they can work with grantees toward shared goals. It's also provided us with a really, really rich data set of tens of thousands of nonprofit perspectives on funders that we can then mine and analyze and try to make meaning from the data. And as I said, we see how important relationships are. So perceptions of relationships, for example, are correlated with grantees' perceptions of the impact that foundations are having. So what then is a relationship as we define it between funders and grantees? It's two broad components: interactions, which is about fairness of treatment by the foundation, comfort approaching the foundation if a problem arises, and responsiveness of foundation staff. And then the second component is communications, which is about clarity of communication of foundation goals and strategy, and consistency of information provided by different communication resources. So those are what we've seen to be the essential components from the grantee perspective of a strong funder-grantee relationship. And we've asked ourselves over the years in various research projects, okay, so if that's what good relationships look like, what does it take for grantees to believe that those strong relationships exist? What are the best predictors of high ratings on the funder-grantee relationship? And so my colleagues have looked at this again, actually many times over the years, and most recently in a report that we put out late last year, authored by Ellie Buteau, who's Vice President for Research here, Jen Glickman, and Matt Lewant. And what they found was that we can actually predict a lot of the ratings based on our analysis. And so what it takes is understanding of grantee organizations and the context in which they work, and transparency from the foundation. Those are the two most important predictors, about equal weight in explaining the relationships ratings. Also important is perceived helpfulness of the selection process, the perception that the funder is open to ideas about strategy, and then the perception that grantees are not being coerced, for lack of a better word, or that they don't feel pressure, rather, to modify their priorities in order to receive funding. So, but what really stands out is the importance of understanding and transparency. Transparency is sort of self-explanatory. It's clarity about for the dimensions that really matter to grantees. For example, what are your goals and strategy? And how do you decide what to do and what not to do? understanding is actually based on a number of different survey items. It has to do with things like Foundation's understanding of grantee organization strategy and goals, awareness of grantees' organizational challenges, understanding of the fields in which grantees work, their local communities, their social, cultural, socioeconomic factors, the intended beneficiaries' needs, and the extent to which the Foundation's funding priorities reflect a deep understanding of grantees' intended beneficiaries' needs. So coming back to where I started, I'm also really proud to be a Leap of Reason ambassador and affiliated with that effort to focus on nonprofit performance. And I'm really pleased that both CEP and the LEAP community reject this idea that there's some kind of dichotomy between funders being focused on impact or focused on relationships. They're often described as intention when in fact, I think they go very much hand in hand. And what we see at foundations like Einhorn, where our speaker, Jen Hoos Rothberg, who I'm going to draw into the conversation now, leads the efforts there, is that in fact, you can be very focused on results, very high touch, high engagement with the nonprofits you fund, and have really strong relationships. Those things don't necessarily have to be intention. So with that as a backdrop, I'd like to bring Jen into the conversation. And Jen, maybe you could start off just by sharing a little bit about what Einhorn Family Charitable Trust is, what are you trying to accomplish, and how you work.
Sure. Thanks so much, Phil and Margot, and to everyone who's joined us today. It's really a great privilege to be part of this. I want to start by saying that we're one foundation who's taking this on in a different way, and our hope is that through this conversation, we can draw out different things that we've tried, tested, so that others can try and test them. This is not, the idea isn't a case study, which feels like, oh, that's just not achievable where I am. We really want to extract lessons here that could be applicable to others. And I'll also just say that we're a total work in progress. So I'm here to share just a moment in time on this long journey of what I would say is philanthropic effectiveness to ultimately help to achieve the impact that we're all after. So a little bit about the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust. We're a family foundation here based in New York City with the mission of helping people get along better. This is a great picture of one of our partners, Playworks, which brings high quality recess back to school across the country. And what you see here is what they call Rochambeau, which is actually rock, paper, scissors, depending what part of the country you're in, which is a tool by which to actually effectively move through disagreements or challenges. And so maybe we use that as a quick metaphor, as Phil, you were looking for them, which is that you never know, but at the end of the day, you play Rochambeau and you move on. And the goal here is that you're on even playing field. You're on the blacktop together and we're all there to have fun. I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is work in partnership with some of the highest quality organizations across the country that are trying to bring empathy, kindness, compassion, cooperation, teamwork to as many people as possible. And we invest in a developmental stage of life approach. So we have efforts that work in parenting in early childhood. We have a huge effort in K-12 education around the social and emotional development and positive school culture for kids in public schools. That's where Playworks does their work. We work on college campuses and then work in the community. And we take the developmental approach because that's what the research really says it takes to develop what we see as a pro-social inclination, which means the positive, voluntary approach to engage with others, especially across difference, productively, purposefully, ultimately to solve problems together. And those problems can be big or small, like who goes next on the slide. So when we think about the work that we do, it's both the what of the helping people get along better, and then it's also the how, which is how we operate our work as grant makers. We see ourselves as grant makers. At the end of the day, we are not the people doing the work on the playground across the country. We invest in high-performing organizations so that they can serve more people on the ground, and they can do it in a way that reflects the needs of those in those communities. We are not the experts. We are generalists. My full team of folks who work here are all generalists purposefully. The idea here is that we can work in partnership with experts so that we can give them the resources they need to do their work in the best way possible. We also recognize that the way an organization operates to achieve impact, the more that we can invest in the bowels, we would say, of the organization. Things that often are seen as unsexy are actually the things that lead to the sexy impact that we're all after. So if you can help an organization, and we can talk about why we look at this from the 7 pillars, by helping to bolster those pillars up, we ultimately can achieve greater impact. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then I'd say our approach, which is important here, is that we typically take a fewer, deeper, longer approach to philanthropy or grant making. And what we mean by fewer, deeper, longer is we invest in fewer things. We invest in them in a deeper way, so we're usually a larger percentage of budget, and we do it in a longer period of time. And that construct of fewer, deeper, longer is directly connected to the results that we got from our GPR, which told us that our highest impact grants were, as defined by CEP, were the ones that where we were engaged with the partner for a longer period of time. The trust they had in us, it was because of the length of our relationship, it just shot up to the top. When we provided large, multi-year, what we would say unrestricted high impact grants towards organizational aims, those were the partners who ultimately said to us that they really felt that we understood what it took for them to accomplish the challenges, and they named us as really understanding what they were after in accomplishing more impact. And that wasn't always tied to grant size, right? I mean, I think that this is relative to an organization. It's being in it with them for a long period of time and working in partnership towards those collective aims. So I'll talk a little bit about how we've used the performance imperative to do this work. And one of the reasons is that the GPR told us that our partners who we had invested in longer were getting greater impact from us. So we thought, well, okay, so what does that mean for shorter relationships? How do we fast track this? And what's really hard about fast tracking something like trust is just think about in your own life what it takes to develop a trusting relationship. I think that it means that you can't just talk about this. You can't just say, I want you to trust me or trust me in this. It's really actions speak so much louder than words. And as funders in particular, we all say a lot of things. And I would argue that our GPR ultimately came down to it was the things that we did that really made the difference in folks saying that we were making a difference in the impact that they were having. Meaning when we were providing support on top of grant dollars, when we were available when they had challenges. So I'll go through quickly about how we're using the performance imperative, and we want to really move through these slides so we can open up to questions. But very briefly, the performance imperative is a tool that Margot spoke about, which was, it speaks about the 7 pillars of high performance across organizations so that they can ultimately accomplish meaningful, measurable, and financially sustainable results. I think Margot said this, but it's very easy, I'm going to say to my colleagues, it's very easy in the philanthropic effectiveness world to write about these things and make tools about these things and talk about why they're important. It's another thing as individual grant makers or program officers when we're sitting here and saying, like, this is our reality and how can we actually apply some of these best practices. So I'll give you a quick case study of how we did this. We looked at the performance imperative and we said, could this be a tool that could help move relationships along the continuum of them really understanding that we were in this with them to accomplish higher what we said, higher impact or higher performance as an organization? Could this be an objective tool to do this? So the first thing we had to do is look at the performance imperative as an internal tool that we could align around. So what does that mean? It's really, instead of all of us just sort of talking around each other of sure we're in the impact business or sure we want to help an organization become higher performing. No, what does it actually mean? We have a definition. We have pillars. We have very specific concrete things we're looking for. Before the performance imperative existed, EFCT had probably a framework we had created ourselves that covered maybe 80% of what was in the performance imperative. And what we were able to do by adopting the performance imperative is we moved to a much clearer, objective, common vocabulary across the team. So if I'm talking to someone on our team and saying, tell me a little bit about their culture of learning, or tell me a little bit about how they approach continuous improvement. It's not ending there. It's actually looking at the definition within the pillars so we could actually align on what we're talking about.
Jen, can I interrupt you here and just say one of the things that people worry about, I think, rightly, is if you've got this framework, and I remember being involved, in the early days of all these drafts of this performance imperative document being circulated, and it's very, very thoughtfully done with input from lots and lots of people, nonprofit leaders. So that's great. So you've got, this was not a funder created definition, but here you are, the funder, saying, well, this is how we're going to look at you and how you're doing. How do you manage that dynamic there? I mean, do you have grantees who say, hey, look, get out of our business? Like, who are you to tell us how you define effectiveness? Or we don't agree that we're not doing well in this area. Or actually, you may have, this performance imperative may have been shaped by a zillion nonprofit leaders, but not us. So no, thank you. Or, maybe they wouldn't be comfortable saying that to you, but somehow that didn't come out in your GPR, right? So how do you avoid that dynamic? So even when grantees had the opportunity to say confidentially, actually, this performance imperative just feels like something being forced down our throats. How is it that you were able to create a dynamic where they also agree that this is useful?
Yeah, I mean, I think this speaks to applying the pillars first to ourselves before applying it to our partners, which is what we call our grantees, which is we looked at this first from an internal alignment tool as to what it is we're after from an impact perspective. Number two, we made no unilateral decision on how we were going to implement this. And so if you were to ask me what are the challenges and the opportunities, one, we do one-on-one customized, I'd say very boutique grant making because we have a smaller portfolio. And so we first started by beta testing this idea with some partners. So once the team aligned, well, this was an interesting tool and maybe we should think about it. I had folks on my team who just said, well, you can't just all of a sudden one fell swoop switch everything that we're doing to the PI. Let's go talk to our partners. And so we had a few partners where we shared it with them. We said, hey, what do you think of the PI? How would you apply this? How would this be helpful in our relationship? How could this be a tool that you, as you're trying to think about bolstering some of these key capabilities in your organization, how could this be a tool that would help you? And guess what? Much easier to do that if you're in a 3 to 5 year partnership with an organization and investing them in a significant way and not in a renewal cycle, right? You have to really think about the timing of when you're introducing new tools like this. You also have to be very clear about what it is you're asking them to do. The goal of the PI for us is not an accountability tool. Like, let's be very clear about this. There's a lot of accountability in philanthropy. It is not an accountability tool for us. It is a learning tool. It is a tool to help our partners see, not good or bad, where are they against a set of capabilities, and where, again, not good or bad. So when you're doing the rating and you're saying, I'm really not doing well on this, or I haven't even started, or I've substantially met this pillar, it's not good or bad, it just is. And as a funder, we then embrace that and say, okay, here are some pillars where it really makes sense to put targeted investment to bolster up this pillar to meet where you're doing great in some of these other pillars. There's no way you can take all of this on in one fell swoop. It's meeting each individual partner where they are, which is our approach to working with our portfolio, and saying, where are you? How can we support you? When we make a high impact grant investing in that organization, how can we align together that actually by investing in some of these pillars, Might it, we ask the question, we're curious, might it actually help us achieve the metrics, the outcomes?
Yeah.
Because we're not making investments here absent of outcomes. I think that there's this strange pendulum in philanthropy, which is like you're either outcomes driven or your relationship in general op. And I would just really argue that they're inextricably linked. The relationship and our ability to really have that trust in the midst of a partnership to say, hey, where are we on this pillar? What do you think about this? Go reflect on this tool. Tell us what you think about it. We're not saying in 6 weeks we have a meeting and you need to deliver the POSA and you need to tell us where you are and everyone on your board needs to take it. And then we're going to take that and then we're going to use that as a formula to determine your investment. Like, it's not at all that.
Margot, go ahead.
Yeah, Jen, just for people who might not be as familiar with the performance imperative, I'm wondering if we can go back to the slide that had the 7 pillars, and you can just quickly run through sort of what's covered. So as we're talking about moving to a high-performing organization, what are the kinds of expectations that the performance imperative lays out? And then I should just say that this was something that was developed by the LEAP ambassadors community. As Phil indicated, there were many dozens of people who were involved in this, most of whom were nonprofit leaders. So this was really intended to be developed by nonprofit leaders for nonprofit leaders. And I think when you're in a funder's chair and trying to build a trusting relationship and a helpful relationship with a grantee, to your question, Phil, using something that was developed by nonprofit leaders feels a little less like this is a hammer that funders are doing to you. This is something your peers have developed. So Jen, maybe you could just spend a minute or two talking about kind of the disciplines that are covered in the pillars, because that might give folks a sense of kind of provide some background to the color that you're providing.
Yes, sure. Sorry about that. I think we jumped over it, but yes. One, as a funder, it's really powerful that this wasn't created by funders. I think that that's crucial. I think funders were at the table, but I think a lot of nonprofit organizations were at the table, and many of the testimonies of how this is effective is coming from the social sector of our nonprofit partners who are seeing this as a useful, reflective tool to name where they are and ultimately how they can become higher performing. I also want to say something else about it that I think is crucial, is there's no ultimate destination. This is not, you can never achieve nirvana here. It is never utopia. The idea here is, how is this a useful guide to ultimately become higher performing? So when we think about our portfolio, we are not comparing apples to apples. We are meeting organizations where they are, and we're saying that the end of our investment, at that junction where we're looking at the next investment, have we shown that they've been able to improve against their own assessment about where they are against these pillars to become higher performing, not high performing, higher performing. So I think every funder who's on the call would say when they are assessing an organization across the board, they have to think about these kinds of categories. And I'd say that the LEAP community categorized them in 7. I will tell you that as someone who's adopted this, it is not perfect. It is also on its own continuous improvement journey, but it is, I would say, don't let perfect be the enemy of progress here. Progress is, how do we use this as a framework to capture 7 pillars around leadership that includes both executives and their board, 2, people management, so all the folks who are working in the organization, how they are actually doing to accomplish their goals, 3, around implemented programs, them being well-designed, well-implemented programs and strategies, 4 is around financial health, 5, I mentioned earlier, around a culture of learning. 6 is continuous improvement. Think about that very much as internal assessment around effectiveness, and 7 is external effectiveness. So really when you bring in third-party evaluation. And at the end of the day, where you are on your journey as an organization, and I would say we take into great account where the size of the organization, we take into account the maturity of the organization, we take into account a whole host of efforts as we're working in partnership with them to think about where they are on this journey.
Yeah, let me try to play the skeptic a little bit and say, like, okay, there's a million frameworks, and you're supposed to have, grantees are supposed to have a theory of change, and then they're supposed to have their performance indicators, and now there's this performance imperative, and then you've got funders also have a range of different ways of thinking about these questions. Well, in some cases, we're really interested in the strength of the organization, long haul. In other cases, actually, we just want to fund this particular piece of work. And then you've got people saying like, what is this effectiveness stuff anyway? It's just like, it's just kind of code for we want to support organizations that already have received a lot of support and not the, younger or more fledgling ones. I guess I'd like to invite, Margot and Jen, you to both try to sort of make the case a little bit as to why this is a useful framework for funders to think about, or is it only for certain kinds of funders? Talk a little bit about it. Jen, you're working in a particular kind of way where you're making very large, long-term grants, to a relatively small set of organizations. A lot of funders are not funding in that way. Does that mean this tool isn't useful to them? What do you two think? I threw a lot out at you, but take any part of it that you'd like.
Yeah, look, I think from my perspective, we have to embrace the skepticism here. I think we can get in framework overload, and we have to be very careful, to your point, of just adding more as funders. For us, it was an organizing tool. It was an organizing principle. It is not a you do it or you don't. It is not black and white. It is not you have to take it all in one fell swoop. I would say if you're doing a lot of grant making across the board to small, even project-based organizations, to start to just introduce this as a tool to organizations to say, hey, as you're thinking about your performance, as you're thinking about if effectiveness is the wrong jargon tool, if you're wondering, are you achieving the goals that you're after? And we want to help organizations have the permission. I think that this is an invitation and a permission to think about things that sometimes aren't immediately directly connected to programmatic outputs on an annual basis. I want to invite the permission to say, what would it mean for us to just have a conversation about some of these other elements about where an organization is? And then I would be so bold, and I know that this is hard, but from organizations and funders, we need to open up our eyes and have a conversation around what does it ultimately take for us to accomplish those goals. And we need to, I think you're right. It puts the organization in a difficult position to say, hey, yeah, I want to achieve twice the number of programmatic outputs, but I've got a staff that's underpaid. So we have to be very real about where we are as a sector. And that's why I love that we've created this funder-only space right now to talk about, well, what does it mean for funders to take on pieces of this, just elements of it that help invite and welcome that conversation.
Marco, how are you seeing other funders use the performance imperative?
Sure. Well, let me just add a few more general comments, Phil, and then I'll get to that quickly.
Great.
I think that the thing about the performance imperative and then the self-assessment, which Jen referred to as the PIOSA, the design was by definition intended to be reflective. So it's not intended to spit out a score that says you are, here's where you rank relative to your peers. It's designed to start a set of conversations that all organizations need to be having about their practice and how to get better. And the things I really like about the performance imperative, and I was not involved in the first iteration of this, so I can say this without sounding sort of self-important in any way. It's flexible. As Jen said, you can take on a piece of it, right? So if you're really struggling with building a learning culture or management in your organization, you can start with pillar 5 or pillar 2. You don't have to take the whole thing. And in fact, I would think most of us would recommend that you don't. It's, I think, equally has the potential of being a reflective exercise for foundations, right? So what is it that we as funders are doing to help organizations around these 7 pillars? When I started as a program officer back in 2004, I will admit to this group, I really didn't know what I was doing. I had been in nonprofit organizations. I had written a lot of grant proposals, but I didn't know how to be a program officer. And Phil, you weren't providing the kinds of resources that you provide now in 2004. And so I was kind of making it up. And had I seen this, it would have given me a framework and a lens to organize, I think, the questions I'd like to believe I intuitively knew how to ask, but in a sort of structured way so that I could sit down with potential grantees and say, let's talk about what you do really well, and let's talk about what you need help with, and how can I be somebody who helps you, and how can the organization where I'm a funder construct our grants in such a way that help you make progress to that end. In terms of what we're seeing around the country, this is relatively early work. Jen is obviously, a real poster child along with her team at Einhorn. But we're seeing an effort in Pittsburgh where 6 foundations have come together and have actually had a competitive process for nonprofits in Pittsburgh. And they have funded 32 leaders who are going to be working in learning circles around 3 self-identified pillars. So there'll be roughly 10 to 12 leaders in each learning circle, and they're focused, they've decided on management, so pillar 2, quality programs, pillar 3, and financial sustainability, pillar 4. And through the year, they will be leading their organization, each leader, through a process of taking that pillar, coming up with an action plan, and working towards getting better. We've got another funder who's interested in trying to do something with a set of program officers in organizations where they work, to look at this and think about how they can use it with their grantees, to sort of start to build that kind of trust around a context, right? So I think what we're seeing is really what was intended, which our funders are using it very flexibly to try to both build trusting relationships and sort of convert their own thinking into kind of an outcomes orientation that's focused not just on number counting, but on improvement, progress, and performance.
Great, great. Well, we're getting a bunch of questions now. I'm going to try to combine a couple. Question about, how does the performance imperative create more trust between funders and grantees? Another question about what the GPR asks specifically that relates to understanding. So I want to make the point, and then go back, Jen, to you, but that to try to connect a little more directly a couple of points I think we're alluding to. When I started off talking about the research we've done on what's really important in creating strong relationships, I talked about understanding being one of the crucial dimensions. And to grantees, and this is all in our report, which is on our website, and I'll hold it up too, called Relationships Matter. That understanding is about a bunch of different dimensions, but it's about, among them, we have items about Foundation's understanding of grantee organization strategy and goals, Foundation's awareness of organization's challenges. And it seems to me that the performance imperative as a framework for a conversation allows funders to actually develop that understanding, right? So I think what we're seeing in the example of Jen and Einhorn is the ability to use this as a tool that both strengthens the relationship because the nonprofits then feel better understood, and then strengthens performance because the funder is able to provide the support that the nonprofit needs in the areas that it feels it most needs to work on. So just to try to make that connection.
Yeah, I think just quickly on that, Phil, if you're using this as a tool to problem solve towards impact, and you're not using this as a tool for accountability, right? And I think that it's really in that if you're using it as a tool where a partner feels that how they reflect on this is going to lead to a funder's decision-making regarding investment, then it negates the entire purpose of the tool. That you lose all of then it merely is a smoke and mirrors funder exercise. It is not creating the environment for real reflection. And so one, I would argue first, help an organization use it as a tool internally if they don't yet have that between you and the funder. This isn't a critical tool that has to happen between the funder and the organization. I think you have to first have the relationship and the trust so that the organization then feels comfortable to be able to actually share the honest assessment of where they are. So the funder has to create the environment where it's safe and comfortable and nurturing, that there's not going to be punitive or repercussions based on where an organization is, especially let's say you thought that there was a succession plan in place and now you learn there isn't a succession plan in place. What happens then? Is the funder going to pull out? No, you as the funder need to say, that's great that we've identified that. How fascinating. I actually thought that was in the board materials, but it's not. What do you think we should do about that over the next 6 months? Is that a goal of yours, or is there something else that you want to prioritize? I think that what you're linking here, which I skipped over, is what does it take to really build high trusting relationships, like what we see as the trusting relationships. You talked about this from the CEP data. I want to talk a little bit about what's the cadence of our work. How do we show up? There are two tools I would just point people to. One, Parker Palmer. If you don't know who he is, just Google him real fast. He created something called the Circle of Trust from the Center of Courage and Renewal. And Parker talks about the idea of asking open, honest questions. And if I were to say that there is one skill that I think is absolutely essential for anyone in a funding role, it's the skill of asking open, honest questions, which means that you have no embedded advice in that question, you have no preordained judgment in that question, and there's no possibility that you could know the answer to the question. Zero. So think about what those questions could be. They're actually hard to ask, but they're the kind of questions that open up someone to reflection. You as the listener are curious because you don't know the answer. You're not listening to yourself to try to figure out, did they understand that I was trying to actually give them advice in that question? No, you're asking an open, honest question. What the performance imperative does is facilitates a structured process to ask open, honest questions about a series of capabilities an organization needs to think about in their journey towards higher performance. So it's an organizing tool for us to say, okay, I want to start asking open, honest questions about, I don't know, financial management. How do I do that in a way where I'm not coming across, even though I've looked at budget, where I'm not coming across with judgment, I'm coming across with just sincere curiosity. I just want to know more. And so that skill in and of itself, with the objective tools and frameworks around the areas that one should be asking these questions, organizes a funder to be able to think about in their process of working with a partner where they are.
Great. I want to get to a couple other questions. Thank you, Jen. There's a couple, Margot, that relate to Pillar 2. And I wonder if you could address it. I mean, one is literally a desire to understand better what it means, disciplined, people-focused management. And of course, there's an explanation of each, and I think people have in their pre-read emails the full document, or you can get it on the LEAP website. So, but one thing is just if you could say a little bit, Margot, about what disciplined people-focused management means. And then the other part of that is, where does diversity in the staff fit in as a priority among the pillars and within the performance imperative?
Great. So disciplined doesn't mean you have a process of discipline the way we think about it being used, say, in the education context, which is where I've spent most of my career, but rather that your organization has the discipline to focus on management. I think all too often, many of us have probably spent time in nonprofits, the issue of the day is meeting the needs of the beneficiaries and the causes that we serve. And we all hire people who are passionate about doing that and think about it 24/7. That sometimes crowds out time focused on developing people, on identifying stars that you want to give stretch roles to so that they can grow in the organization and take on leadership roles or even go run another nonprofit at some point. And frankly, on focusing on the people who are not a good fit and confronting that and dealing with it. And what Pillar 2 focuses on is all of that and the sort of tools that organizations need to have in place in order to be able to focus on the people side of their work, because lots of the nonprofit world is a function of the people who are in it, which is a nice segue to the second point. When the performance imperative was first created, there were lots of conversations about lots of topics that should be included. And then there were not some conversations about topics that as a result of kind of reflection, people have decided should be included. And so we are going through a process of revisiting the performance imperative to figure out what doesn't exist as first and as sort of as boldly and as clearly as it should, while there are certainly some elements that are reflective of diversity in the performance imperative. I can tell you that it's one of the topics that the group is dealing with now and trying to sort of bring to a more prominent role. There have also been conversations about constituency feedback, which is not featured very prominently in this iteration of the performance imperative, and advocacy, which is also not featured particularly prominently in this version. That said, there's lots to work on, I think, in this one, and we'll be working on a version 2, which will include some of those other topics.
Great, thank you for that. There's a couple of questions that relate to your processes at Einhorn, Jen. So both the proposal and selection process and the reporting and evaluation process. And I think people are wondering, both questions really are about how the performance imperative informs or integrates into those processes, or do you keep it separate because of your desire to ensure that it doesn't feel, like a high stakes or potentially punitive conversation? How do you handle those important processes for funders and grantees?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I mean, I think we're still, again, we're still iterating ourselves. I'll tell you where we are right now and things that we're hoping to do as we go forward. So for one, we look at working in partnership with organizations that we have a sense are already sort of fitting our criteria. So we are willing to have conversations with many organizations to figure out from what it is they're doing, does it start to fit the kind of organizations that we invest in? Typically, we invest in large organizations that are in a position to get to national scale, that are in a moment where by receiving what we typically look at around growth capital, by utilizing that capital, by investing in the capabilities of the organization, they're going to get to those more meaningful, financially sustainable, measurable results. And so very early, I think the way we use the performance imperative as an internal team is we have a quick guide across the pillars of where an organization is, of just sort of meeting where are they from a sort of a footprint. First checking, do they sort of address the issues that we're after around the helping people get along better, which we have particular goals in each of our developmental stages of life. And this is on our website, and I'm happy to go deeper if people want to follow up and learn more about sort of the what we invest in and then connected to the how. The how is where the performance imperative comes in, that as we're in the due diligence process or we're really meeting with and talking to a prospective grantee, our hope is that through multiple conversations, we can start to explore where they are against some of these pillars, recognizing that we're using it as a tool. So we have program officers on our team, we call them domain managers, who will send a note out and say, I'm wondering if we can have a conversation with your CFO to talk about Pillar 4. Pillar 4, I'm going to shoot it over to you. These are a couple topics. This gives you a sense of the questions that I'm going to ask. I'm wondering if we can get on the phone and talk a little bit about where you are against this. And in the process, recognizing that we say, this is a reflective tool. We're not saying to you good or bad. We're just curious where you are and how you approach these things as an organizing principle. That's one way we're using it sort of in our due diligence process. I think the other thing I should name is we don't accept proposals typically. So for these larger investments, we only invest in organizations' strategic plans, plans that organizations have developed internally, that they're operating against, that their board has signed off on. And our goal is to be able to invest in those plans so that we're aligning on the goals they've named in those plans, along with other funders who invest in those plans. And so what we'll do is we'll look at a strategic plan and we'll say, hey, we're curious in this plan, where does the principle under Pillar 4 financial management come up for you? And we can ask it again in that open, curious way, because we're using their strategic plan alongside the pillars to just marry up sort of where are they against some of these goals. That's really a helpful process. But I will name, I mean, our GPR is on our website and we completely shared it openly with the world, and folks spend an inordinate amount of time in our due diligence process. We have a lengthy process and it's not for everyone. I think the average amount, we're in the top percentiles. It's something like 150 hours. We're like in the 99 to 100th percentile. But what I would say is we're also in the 98th percentile for helpfulness of our proposal process. And the reason why I'm comfortable with those things together is we don't see it as a proposal process. We see it as a reflective process to go through in partnership with an organization where they really are against these key pillars within their strategic plans, and then providing the kind of investment in those plans so that they ultimately can achieve those goals. We then will work in partnership with that organization to work with their other funders as well as their other prospective funders to align collectively around what we see investment in that organization would help them improve upon in certain pillars towards those objective goals that they've named. And so we have some partners where their reporting tool, which was the second part of your question, is the same tool for all of the funders in that national organization. So Playworks, where we started, is an example of that, where all of the funders who have invested in Playworks growth have aligned on the same objective measures against their own strategic plan, and embedded in their reporting framework is the performance imperative, where they are naming at every 6-month juncture where they are against particular pillars that are important to them. They're sharing that with the whole group of all of us as funders, reflecting on that collectively, then returning to that again 6 months later as their own sort of goal setting process. And what that does, we were able collectively, Playworks, EFCT, alongside large and small institutional, family, high net worth, a whole host of different kinds of funders, to use that as a tool where all of us were saying, you know what, for Playworks, this actually works as an organizing principle for them to talk about where they're hoping to improve. And it was enough to meet the needs of each of the funders at the table for their own reporting requirements. That is a really, that's a, sort of an example of, now that is a goal that I would hope for in all of our partners, but we have not gotten there yet. We've had other peer funders who they're not ready for that. And so we'll say, okay. Or we have organizations who are not ready for that, and that's okay. It's the journey along that process.
Great. I want to ask one more question, and again, I'm going to try to weave together a couple of themes that are coming through in the many questions that we're receiving. I guess it would be, let me try to frame it like this. We at CEP, work with a lot of foundations, and I think sometimes people forget that even among the larger few hundred foundations in the country, most are regionally focused. Most are funding organizations that have budgets, at the median that are maybe $1.5 million. Many foundations are funding mostly organizations with budgets well under $1 million. Furthermore, many funders have boards who really aren't keen on allowing them to give general operating support. So maybe they're one of a number of different funders. So they're providing some project support to relatively small, pretty stressed grantee organizations. If you're someone like that on this webinar right now, is this relevant to you? What can a funder in that situation, working with those kind of grantees, take out of this conversation and the performance imperative? I think we're a little low on time, but just quick answers from each of you.
The first thing I would do is suggest that people go to the LEAP Ambassadors website and look for Small But Mighty, which is essentially a piece that talks about how to take the performance imperative and make use of it in small nonprofits. And so while the performance imperative, primarily because of the 7th pillar and external evaluation, was initially focused on organizations that have budgets of $3 million, Small But Mighty focuses on the very small organizations. And it talks, I think, in very clear ways about how to tailor this concept. Much of it, I think, is broadly applicable, but for those parts that aren't, I think this is a particularly good piece, and I would start there.
Great. Jen?
Yeah, I would start with the trusting relationship. I would say at the end of the day, that is the foundation that gets all of us to achieve greater impact, no matter what your grant-making footprint is, size, region, project, unrestricted. At the end of the day, if you can help develop a trusting relationship where your partner grantee feels comfortable coming to you with challenges, and it doesn't happen immediately. We track this. We think about when's the turning point for a partner to really feel comfortable coming to us and expressing challenges. And if you can facilitate a relationship where you can help your partner feel comfortable sharing with you challenges, I think then you can start talking about, well, what would it help? What kinds of things could they think about to mitigate those challenges? Yep. And my guess is in mitigation of challenges, it's not just ultimately trying to achieve the next number of programmatic outputs. There are other things happening at the organization that if we can help reduce the level of tension and stress for all of those organizations that you're talking about, thinking about bolstering capabilities. Now, even if you're giving project support, what coaching, what support can you provide? How can you bring other funders to the table? How can you open doors? What non-monetary support can you provide? I'd say at the end of the day, this isn't just about our grants. We talk to all of our partners at least quarterly. We are on the phone with them. The more you can be there, what does it mean to be a trusting relationship and partner in this? It means being there when in the good and in the bad. Yep. And I'd start there. Think about what it means when you have, who's your most trusting friend? What are the things they do for you? And how might you do that for your partner grantees?
Great. I want to hand it back over to Margot to wrap it up. Before I do, let me just say, I got involved with the ambassadors and the Performance Imperative Project. You know, Mario Marino had reached out to me, and I was initially a little skeptical that something could be created that would be applicable to the diverse range of small and large organizations in this country. And I think I would just encourage everyone on the call to really check it out if you haven't read it. Obviously, it's not perfect, and as Margot said, it's being iterated. I really do think it has broad relevance for every organization. I want to thank Jen for sharing her story and for committing to getting feedback with CEP. And thank you, Margot, and I'll let you wrap us up.
Great, thanks. And just one footnote on my comment about potential performance imperative version 2. And Jen and Phil both know this, but there are over 150 LEAP ambassadors, and this is something that is collectively developed. So while I threw out a couple of topics people have nominated for future iterations, they may not be grappled with fully in the next iteration, because that's not up to me or to Phil or to Jen. It's up to 150 plus leaders from around the country. I want to just close by thanking all of you so much for attending. We hope that this has whet your appetite about both the GPR and the performance imperative, the ways in which those can be used to build trust, to start these kinds of conversations, as Jen alluded to, and also sort of organize a very developmental approach to getting better, both as funders getting better and as partners with our grantees in really providing the wide range of assistance that Jen alluded to. You'll be getting a follow-up email with links to further information. I know that all of us are eager to engage with you, to hear about your stories in this vein and see how we can help. So thank you so much to all of you, and we look forward to hearing about your important work.